Good afternoon, everyone. Just giving probably just under a minute just to allow some other people to join, and then we'll get going. Right. Welcome, everyone, to COMO UK's September webinar, Peddling a Green Recovery, Scotland's Bike Share and a Greener Future. I'm Harriet Cross, Senior Development Officer for COMO UK, which is the national charity supporting the development of shared mobility for the public good. Specifically, COMO UK advocates for the benefits of the development of successful bike share schemes. This is due to the benefits of providing a low carbon form of travel, a healthier and often cheaper way to travel. And through our annual bike share survey, we know that bike share is a catalyst for getting people back onto bikes who perhaps relapsed, getting people to own a bike, and also facilitating modal shift from cars to bikes. Scotland has a lot going on in terms of bike share development. So we wanted to host this webinar to provide an overview of the types of schemes that exist, how the pandemic has impacted this landscape, and also touch on bike share's role in a greener recovery, as well as hopefully being a springboard to further conversations beyond this webinar. So we have some great people to help us do this today. We have Councillor Anna Richardson, who is going to talk about the vision to transform Glasgow cycling networks. Oliver O'Brien, he'll be sharing insight into the impact of the pandemic on bigger schemes in Scotland. And what this might mean for a greener future. Shirley Patterson, apologies, not Sheila, Shirley Patterson, Active Travel Manager at Forth Environment Link. Shirley will be sharing an update on the UK's first bike share scheme in Stirling and what's next for them. Followed by Tim Hughes from Dumlane Development Trust. Tim will provide his reflections on community-led bike share schemes, including the challenges and opportunities this approach presents. And then wrapping up, we'll have Lorna Finlayson, Scotland's Director of COMO UK, and Lorna will be giving an update on our free rides initiative and some thoughts on how bike share can be a viable transport provision. So we've brought these people together to hopefully give a picture of bike share in Scotland and the impacts that some of the schemes are having. And just some housekeeping, just to let everyone know, the webinar is public and open to the media. Any questions, please put them in the chat function that you'll see on your screen, and I'll pick those up throughout the webinar, and then we'll have a chance to have a Q&A session just towards the end, and we're aiming to finish the webinar by 3. Before I pass over to Anna to kick things off, I wanted to share this next slide to share a better understanding of what we mean as bike share in Scotland. Also, the definitions that COMO has for bike share. This map captures most of the schemes in Scotland, and we tend to define these as firstly the larger public on-street schemes, such as in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, soon to be Dundee and Inverness, and they tend to have a fleet size of 30 to 500. Secondly, community bike share schemes, which might be bike loans, bike libraries for communities to borrow, slightly more tailored schemes to fit the location and users. The fleet size tend to be about 10. And then we have the more specific schemes for organisations that might be for council staff or universities, hospitals, and these tend to be kind of closed bike share schemes. And of course, there can be a blend of all of them, but this is just to demonstrate coverage, and also just to say thank you for this information. It came from Cycling Scotland's Access to Bikes report that they've recently published, which we've extrapolated some of the information from. And all of these schemes have been set up to get people on bikes, get people healthier, and replace car journeys with low carbon forms of transport. So with all that in mind, I'm delighted to pass over the presentation to Anna Richardson.
Thank you for that. I'm just loading this up. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that? Harriet, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks very much for having me along today. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of Glasgow's bike share scheme that we run in conjunction with Nextbike. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've adapted to COVID and touch on some walking and cycling improvements that are happening as well, and that's really accelerated over the last 6 months. So for those who aren't familiar with Glasgow's bike share scheme, we launched with Nextbike in 2014. And we expanded into a second contract with Nextbike in 2017. At the time, we had a target of 100 stations and 1,000 bikes by 2025. We've already reached 79 stations and 800 bikes, so we're well ahead of schedule on that. And as well as the planned expansion, we've also been seeking additional funding where we can, which has allowed us to make faster progress than initially envisioned, for example, through Scottish Government funding attached to low emission zones in Scotland that enabled us to put extra stations in. And last October, we launched our fleet of e-bikes as part of the Nextbike scheme, and they've proven to be very popular. We launched the first 63 bikes at 21 docking stations last year, and we are already beginning to expand that, the e-bikes, over the next couple of weeks. But despite all of this progress, we still need to move a lot faster. We continue to get requests in from members of the public for more stations, for more bikes. Communities are desperate for us to come to them next. And I think that's a good problem to have. It just shows how successful the scheme has been so far, that it's a very valued part of Glasgow's transport network, and that it feels like a bike share that very much belongs to Glasgow and to the people of Glasgow, and they all want to be part of that. And this sustainable growth that we've shown, I think, is a real success story for us. And in June this year, we marked our 1,000th hire, which just shows how much these bikes are out and about on the road. And of that 1 million hires, half of those were in 2019 alone. And cycling has shown itself over lockdown to be a very resilient mode of transport. We've seen more people out and about cycling across the city, whether experienced cyclists or whether people who've been trying a bike for the first time. And our bike share data has also shown the same trend. After a bit of a dip at the very start of lockdown when nobody was leaving the house, we have seen increases on 2019 figures for bike hire, and 22% increase, for example, in July 2020 as opposed to July 2019. And I think it's very significant that working from home and minimising unnecessary travel is still the prevailing message here from the government, and so those figures are showing that even in a time where a lot of travel demand is dampened, bike share continues to grow. And then, most excitingly of all, for the Nextbike scheme, we were able to bring in this 30 minutes free offer, thanks to Scottish Government funding through Paths for All. And this was initially a trial period, which was then extended to March 2021. It's really significant because we think this is an opportunity to provide a low-cost transport option and to really mainstream bike share as a practical way to move around the city. And for a long enough period of time over the winter that we're able to create new habits for people. This bike share free offer is here all winter, all of spring, and that's enough time really for people to start thinking that might be a habit they want to keep. But of course, bike share isn't the only thing that we've had to do to support cycling during the pandemic. Glasgow has been at the forefront of Scotland's response to creating temporary measures to enable walking, cycling and wheeling during the pandemic. So with a total of £7.5 million of government funding, we are in the middle of a programme to build a variety of spaces for people. For example, pop-up cycle lanes. This one is along the Clyde in Glasgow. It already has a cycle lane down by the riverside, which is a shared use path, and it just was not coping with the amount of cycle traffic and more walking as well during the lockdown especially. So we have built this dedicated cycle lane taking road space, and it has been hugely popular. We are expanding our school car-free zones quite significantly. We brought our first 6 car-free zones in around schools last year as a pilot, and as a result of COVID and seeing quite how many people are bunched up around school gates, we felt that we couldn't wait for that pilot to run its course. So we have another 21 schools anticipated to roll out in the next couple of weeks. And that allows social distancing at schools, as I said, but it also starts to encourage active travel and to really push the behaviour change that we need of people walking and cycling to school. And we created a lot of traffic-free space, such as here, this is Kelvin Way. This road runs alongside Kelvin Grove Park and right beside the Museum and Art Gallery as well. And this used to be busy with traffic and parked cars. By blocking off this street, we've created a much more open space. It connects into one of the local primary schools, and it just makes that area feel more welcoming to people, especially those who are maybe not so used to cycling and just want a little bit more open space to do so. So it's been very, very successful. It's been a real gear change in terms of creating lots of space in this part of the city. And we are now doing a little bit of work just to make sure that that is a sustainable road closure that can continue for the longer term. But of course, our long-term ambitions haven't been put on hold either. So we are currently working on a new transport strategy and an active travel plan for Glasgow, which will ensure that our transport network responds to the climate emergency and our ambition to be carbon neutral by 2030. As part of that, we'll also develop a plan for a comprehensive network of cycle lanes. And here's one that is going in Garscube Road as we speak. And good infrastructure goes hand in hand with BIKESHARE. Both make cycling feel like an option that's for anybody, whether they have access to their own bike or not. And here in Glasgow, the majority of our residents live in flats or tenements. So bike use, without the trouble of bike storage, can be a very appealing proposition. And we've been adding hire stations along new cycle lane projects. Here on South City Way, taking you from a busy residential part of Glasgow straight into the city centre, we have put the BIKESHARE stations along the way to try and strengthen those connections and make it clear that this is a holistic strategy. This approach can have some drawbacks as well. It can mean that BIKESHARE sometimes follows the pattern of investment in cycle lanes, which historically focused more heavily in certain parts of the city to the south and to the west. This is changing now. We are about to begin construction on the East City Way, and we have our sights set firmly in the north of Glasgow as well. But the great thing about Spaces for People is that it is an opportunity to redress this balance very, very quickly. We don't have to wait for years for new cycle lanes to come on board. We've built almost 30 kilometres of these temporary lanes through Spaces for People. This is Cumbernauld Road in the northeast of the city, one of our temporary measures, and in an area that does not have a cycle network at the moment. But another challenge here is that we're going to have to find new ways to rapidly expand our next bike network across the city, especially if we're serious about tackling transport inequality at the same time as the climate emergency. So I'll leave it there. That's a very brief overview of our current situation. I'm really optimistic that this crisis has given us a chance to accelerate our move to sustainable transport and to bring BIKESHARE to a much wider audience. And I will very much look forward to answering any questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. Really great to know about the different infrastructure developments, because as we know, they're fundamental to make successful bike share schemes, and also the number of rides using the Next Bike bikes from 2019 to 2020. Sorry about the sound earlier. We've hopefully resolved those issues, maybe by me just speaking a bit closer to the laptop. I'd now like to invite Oliver to give his presentation on the impact of the pandemic on bike share schemes in Scotland, and a bit of insight into how lessons we might know about moving into a greener recovery. Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you, Harriet. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so focusing on the public bike shares in Scotland, and as I say, what's been happening over the last few months and what I think could happen in the future. So I'm just going to very briefly reintroduce public bike share schemes in Scotland and how large they are. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic, in other words, the usage of the bike shares and how it's changed since March until now. I'm then going to have a little bit of thoughts about what could be happening in the next few months as well, and then finally introduce some additional resources which may be useful. Okay, so there's I believe currently four major public bike share systems in Scotland. There's Edinburgh, which is a Serco-led system, but with using the urban sharing platform. It has actually 350 bikes on the street today, up from 310 when I had to look at the weekend. It's mainly a manual fleet, but with some pedelecs as well. Glasgow, as I say, we've just had an excellent presentation of details of the Glasgow system. So just to summarize, it's from the Next Bike. There are, again, exactly the same as Edinburgh, 350 bikes currently on the street. And again, it's manual with some pedelec. The architecture is slightly more complicated in Glasgow in that some docking stations will only accept pedelecs, that's electric bikes, and some will only accept manual bikes. Stirling is a smaller system, but also using Next Bike's technology, and it has around 90 bikes currently available. They're all manual. And then finally, there's a Forth Valley system, which is quite different to the other public bike share systems, and we'll hear more about Forth Valley from a later speaker. The platform is Berwigan, and it has currently 90 pedelecs available to use. It's a regional system, which means its use is quite different to the city systems. Just a quick note about some other forthcoming public bike share systems. The Inverness one should be coming next year. Dundee is very delayed, but as of this week, a new press release has gone out saying that it will be launching this autumn with 400 fully electric bikes. Finally, Aberdeen is retendering, and the Dumfries is, I should mention, pretty much the first Scottish public bike share system. It's long closed, but it was very much a pioneer in that regard. Okay, so the impact of the pandemic on Scotland's public bike shares. Now, they did all remain open, and the city ones in particular have very much reaped the benefit of enthusiasm of getting around your city in a way which is socially distant, but also relatively cheap. In other words, cheaper than, say, getting a cab. Edinburgh did reduce the size of its fleet by around 50% in late March, at the beginning of the pandemic, but by mid-May, it had essentially recovered its fleet size to around 350 bikes that it currently has on the street. Very much, it's for car-free households, of which there are many in certain parts of our cities. Bike share is very much a lifeline. It is perhaps an obvious alternative form of transport, particularly due to the so-called run on the bikes. This is when, certainly in my local area, we saw long queues outside Halfords as people wanted to buy a bike, and Halfords quickly ran out of cheaper bikes. And so people who were very keen to now start cycling in order to fulfill their journeys in a socially distant way some people were able to switch to the public bike share systems. And again, as mentioned briefly by the last speaker, public authority enthusiasm has resulted in free trip starts in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Stirling, which is hopefully lowering the cost of barriers to people trying out bike share systems on a speculative basis. And if they try these systems with half an hour free, then maybe they'll understand that this is a potentially very good economic and beneficial way of moving around the local cities. So in the next section, I'm going to present some daily graphs. These are from the 9th of March and the 14th of September, the detailed graphs. In other words, very recently, after around 6 months of pandemic impact, and also just before. But first of all, I'm going to mention these sort of overall graphs, and these are from a project at the Consumer Data Research Centre, which I work at, and we call it the Bike Share Recovery Index. Essentially what we've been doing is we've been looking at the daily peak usage sizes for all medium or large systems in the UK. By daily peak usage, I mean the maximum simultaneous usage. So if, say, a fleet has around 200 bikes and a maximum of 50 of them being used at once at some point in that day, then we say that has a maximum daily usage of 50. And the reason why we use this metric is we can very quickly, it's a proxy for the number of journeys effectively, and we can very quickly get data on that. So even if the system doesn't announce how many journeys are being done on a particular day, we can still infer that from this, and we can very quickly and rapidly look at what's happening. Just to say on this graph, which essentially covers all the major systems in the whole of the UK, you can see very much this is a story that's been repeated in many other forms of transport in the UK as well. We saw a big, and this is it's calibrated to 100% just in early March. We saw a big drop down to around 25%. The London one, which does dominate the numbers here, is in red, and you can see that that is recovered after about a month and a half, but then sat at around 50 to 60% of its usage, and it's only really properly recovered in the last couple of weeks, as people in September have been serious about going back to work in London. Other systems outside of London are in orange, and this includes all the Scottish systems, of course, and you can see that they recovered much more quickly, although they did still see a big dip at the beginning of April. And indeed, due to our very sunny summer that we had, usage of it has actually been extremely good. Okay, so apologies if the resolution on this is a little bit hard to see, but this is one of my sort of internal graphs I use for monitoring bike shares around the world, indeed. And as I say, the top graph is early March, and the bottom graph is mid-September. And this is just showing a snapshot of the number of available bikes at 2-minute intervals across 24 hours. Now, the interesting thing about this is you can see, in this case, is Edinburgh one, you can see there is a distinct drop, which is a increase in usage, simultaneous usage of the bikes, occurring at your classic commuter time around 7 or 8 in the morning. And the good thing about that drop is it's still there in September. So the commuters have, to a certain extent, returned. But the big difference, of course, is you can see a big afternoon dip. And this is corresponding to leisure usage, which is most popular in the afternoons. And that combines with the evening peak as well, or the evening drop. And you can see that is a significant change with what was happening before. Now, as I say, I have just picked one day in early March, and the weather might have been bad on that day. But certainly it seems that the style and character of how people use the bike share in Edinburgh has changed. And this is my summary graph of Edinburgh. So the blue here are morning commuters, and then the other colours are weekdays and weekends for full day usage. And as a very rough rule of thumb, you can multiply the numbers on the left by about 6 or 7 to get a rough indication of a number of journeys. Edinburgh, of course, does actually publish the number of journeys as well, but this method allows me to compare Edinburgh, Glasgow, and various other systems. And you can see a characteristic dip at the beginning of April for commuters, which is then slowly recovered and is essentially back to what it was before, whereas you can see that the general weekday and weekend usage remained healthy and indeed has been spectacular, nothing short of spectacular in the summer months, certainly. And it's still at a high level even now in mid-September or late September. So to summarise Edinburgh, commuter use has recovered. Leisure use is very much better than it was before in Edinburgh. There is certainly a population that has very much discovered the bike share in Edinburgh, and hopefully it will a population that will continue through the winter months as well. This is a similar graph for Glasgow. Now, again, we've got the morning peak, we can see as a big dip at a certain characteristic time. However, Glasgow has really discovered the bikes in leisure usage, very much more so than Edinburgh has. So in Glasgow, you can see there's a commuter dip in the morning and in the afternoon for both the March and the September graph, but it's overwhelmed by this huge, massive dip that basically starts around midday and carries on to about 9 or 10 p.m. And that's essentially just a large population of people on the bike in the afternoon in Glasgow. And we see this most days now. And again, this is a similar graph for Glasgow, and as mentioned by the previous speaker, we saw a characteristic dip in commuters. However, the leisure usage never really went away in Glasgow, and then it boomed very much as we had our warm summer. So to summarise Glasgow, commuter usage recovered, but leisure use is huge now. It really is very, very popular to be using the bike shares in Glasgow for leisure use. I'm going to very briefly mention Stirling. There's little that we can see from Stirling. It is a lightly used system, and there's not many trends that are helpful to present here. And I'm going to lump in Forth Valley as well. Stirling and Forth Valley are relatively lightly used systems. Stirling has always been very little used for commuters, and it does have a base level of tourism, but that has therefore more likely suffered more significantly over the summer than the big city systems. And Forth Valley is the same as well. It's lightly used, and it's traditionally not been used for commuters. It's not designed that way. It's not designed as a commuter system, and therefore we've we've seen quite different patterns to the old ones. So just looking forward to the future, say Edinburgh and Glasgow have very much been discovered by their populations as a result of lockdown, and this has undoubtedly made both systems more healthy. Hopefully the economics are better, and if they can continue to weather the issues that we have with pandemics, such as obviously people concerned about availability of them, and whether they are a healthy, clean and safe way to run the city, then they will continue to emerge much more healthily. As I say, Stirling and Forth Valley are very small for this meaningful analysis. It does look like they have suffered more than Edinburgh and Glasgow during the downturn. They are quite small. I've mentioned here that Stirling would be great if it had a pedelec system, because of course Stirling is quite a hilly city, and Forth Valley also would definitely benefit from more docking stations being located at railway stations, commercial centres, to allow people arriving who may no longer want to travel on a bus, but still want to get around the various towns and cities which the Forth Valley system represents. So what happens now? It is making a bike share to both, it is making a difference to both Glasgow and Edinburgh. It definitely has potential for other Scottish cities as well, particularly with increasing options for pedelecs these days and costs coming down. Now, I'm going to very briefly mention e-scooter share. Now, of course, there is a legislative issue in Scotland, which means that the e-scooter share trials that we are seeing in England will be slower to come to Scotland, if at all. However, there are some fantastic data coming out from the trials so far in England. It's very early data, but it's extremely promising, to the point that I'd say do not underestimate that this could be a much bigger change to how people move around our cities than bike share will be. And as I say, it may well be eat bike share's lunch, even if it's not a form of active transport. So the green recovery, bike share is certainly a cheap way to help towards making the recovery a green one. The recent public subsidies have definitely helped people using their otherwise relatively expensive systems in the cities to discover bike share. So just to quickly summarize some further reading on this, you may be interested in Bike Share Map, which is a website I run, which shows live information about where all bikes are in Glasgow, where they're available in Glasgow and Edinburgh and other cities. And there is a project called Bike Sharing World Map, which is essentially a gazetteer of all the world systems, and I'm the European editor of that, so I'm always keen to hear what's happening in Scotland and get new tips on new systems that are being set up here. And finally, the graphs I showed you from the COVID-19 UK Bike Share Recovery Index, which is available on the CDRC website, and I run a blog called Bike Sharp, and also I'm writing for a new magazine on e-scooter share as well. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks very much, Oliver. A really comprehensive overview of bike share schemes in Scotland and data usage and how it relates to commuting and leisure journeys. And I really like the idea of Glasgow and Edinburgh discovering themselves through bike share, which I think shows the great potential bike share can have. And also to say we'll be sharing these presentations round at the end of the webinar, so all of the information Oliver's included can be shared. So I'd now like to invite Shirley to give her presentation on the first UK school bike share scheme, and yeah, to give an update on where that's at and plans for the future. Thanks, Shirley.
Okay, so as Harry's introduced, I'm Shirley Patterson from Forth Environment Link, and Harry, can I just check that you can see my slides?
Yes, I can.
Okay, because I'm struggling to forward them on to the next.
Can you press next? Just to the right, there.
No, sorry. Oh, yeah, it's okay, I've got it. Sorry.
Good.
Thanks, Harry. Okay, so we're a small charity based in Forth Valley, and one of our principal aims is to get people to cycle and walk more for short everyday journeys. We principally do our work through 2 active travel hubs, one in Falkirk and one in Stirling, but we've got 3 other satellite stations, one in a secondary school and another 2 bespoke satellite hubs in hospitals. I'm just going to give you a bit of history over bike sharing in Stirling, which Oliver's given you a little bit about as well. So Stirling introduced its first public bike share in 2014. It was a legacy of the Commonwealth Games, and Nextbike was the winning contractor at that time. So in 2014, we had 11 stations and 100 bikes, and then we were fortunate to double that in 2016 making 23 docking stations throughout the city. And at this time, as you can see from the graph, at the time that we put in 23 stations, the bike usage tripled 300%, really exacerbating or emphasising that if you flood the streets with docking stations, people will use it because they're more accessible to everybody easily and readily to where people want them. We decided in 2019 to expand our BIKESHARE scheme, our NextBike BIKESHARE scheme, by installing 4 additional bespoke stations right at the front entrances of our 4 secondary schools. So this took the citywide scheme to 27 stations. And the reasons for this decision was primarily because Stirling operates within its 4 high schools a citywide learning campus. So pupils move between different high schools to pick up curriculum subjects that are not offered in their own high school. And it became clear at this time, sort of 2018-19, that schools were ferrying pupils across the city by car or taxi. So from our point of view, this wasn't sustainable. It was increasing congestion on the roads, but also there was a budget element for the schools at that point. They had to find money to pay for those services. We hope by installing the bikes at the schools, we could offer an alternative way for students to travel across the city, but also to give them an option for travelling to leisure facilities, cinema, but also to part-time employment after school hours. To facilitate all of this, we negotiated with NextBike to increase the journey time from 30 minutes to 60 minutes to give them more time to get to places, and decrease the age limit from 16 to 14 years of age, which allowed us to work with S4 and S6. And the pupils who accessed the school BIKESHARE scheme also had access to the citywide BIKESHARE scheme as well, so over 160 bikes. And the need for this was from evidence of a 2017 survey that showed that cycling among school pupils dropped dramatically between primary school and secondary school. So what we really hoped was that by encouraging pupils to cycle from 14 upwards, we would instill a behaviour change at a time that would embed within them long-term going into university, leaving home, leaving school, and before they automatically got a car key at the age of 17, it would become a natural habit to jump on a bike and not just on a car. So our expectations was to raise physical activity levels within schools, to ward off car dependency, both within the school, but also, as I said, later in life, to give pupils an opportunity for free transport. So the pocket money that they had in their back pockets didn't necessarily have to go on bus transport, but it could go on other things. The conveniency of having bikes readily at hand at their doorstep, they didn't have to wait at bus stops or for timetables. They had an opportunity, if they went on to other cities such as Aberdeen or Glasgow or Edinburgh, to have the skills to use BIKESHARE for further education, and to also build transferable skills such as confidence, independence and resilience, so lifelong skills that they could take when they left school. So we launched the scheme in autumn 2019, and to date we have trained 40 and worked with 47 students. This stopped in March because of COVID, and we're hoping to be able to go back into the schools after October and continue this work. So we've delivered a presentation to all 4 secondary schools in their school assemblies, explaining NextBike, explaining BIKESHARE, explaining what the scheme is about, and offered and invited students to come to us for training. So all pupils that were interested have been given a half-day training package, which involved bikeability, essential skills training, which allowed us to assess their confidence and skills levels on manoeuvres, stopping, signalling. They were then taken out on a led ride through the city on the streets themselves, and then helped them register with NextBike and their free passes to NextBike city scheme. And once they've completed that training package, they were given a voucher for a local bike shop worth £30, which with a purpose to go and make sure they had a helmet and PPE. The little yellow bubble speeches that you see in the next few slides are direct quotes and feedback from the pupils. And the main things that they got out of the training day was road training, specifically road training and cycling with friends. Although our expectations at the start of the project was very much to allow cross-curriculum training across schools, what we've discovered that the main use of the NextBike has been within the sports leadership courses, working very closely with Active Stirling who are another partnership that work in the schools to allow secondary school pupils to go to feeder primary schools for coaching lessons. The journeys are much shorter, which means it's much more doable within the class time that is available. So lessons learned. As part of the promotional campaign, we got the schools to design their own Next Bike panels. So the panel that goes at the back of the bikes. So these were individually designed by pupils. It meant that we had launch materials available. It created an early relationship with the schools and allowed cross-curriculum within the school as well. So it involved art and design and other pupils that perhaps wouldn't be necessarily cycling on the bikes. I've mentioned partnerships. It's really important to find out who else is accessing the school and what partnerships you can use within them, because it makes it easier for the schools to work as one project. The kids loved the fact that the bikes were free, convenient, no bus timetables. A lot of the schools the pupils quickly learned that they could access after-school clubs, sports club, music clubs, and other schools across the city very conveniently and very free. And perhaps not the best, but some kids also realised it could get to the local bakers very quickly at lunchtime, but they were still used nevertheless. From the school's perspective and from our perspective, it's really, really difficult to get all the kids involved that wanted training at the same time, working with 3 age categories, so S4 to S6, and finding a time and the timetable for all those pupils to gather to get the training involved was extremely difficult. We reduced the training originally from a day to half a day to help, but it still led to some problems. One school in particular had quite a lot of concern over the fact that it was a public bike share scheme, which would be at the school entrance, which would allow the public at large to come and use those bikes too. And there was an element of safety within that and trying to protect pupils of early ages and inviting strangers into the school grounds. I think it's important as well to find out what the school has in mind for these bikes. Different schools, different head teachers have different visions, whether it's from a sporting angle or as part of a cross-curriculum, active travel, sustainable travel initiative within the school. As I've mentioned earlier on, we didn't launch the scheme due to delays in installation until autumn last year, which wasn't perfect, although it linked or coincided nicely with Bike to School Week, which meant we did get a lot of PR. From the pupils' perspective, it meant that we were trying to train and bring them on board cycling in the darker winter months. So think about the time that you want to launch these projects and get the schools involved. No matter how much you try, pupils tend not to wear waterproof trousers, jackets, or warm clothing, and that was a bit of a barrier. The vouchers that we offered as a thank you for going through a thank you and an encouragement to use the bikes wasn't seen to be cool enough. Again, helmets are an important element within teenagers. So again, think about what the incentive is. And although we were trying to support local shops by offering vouchers specifically for cycle shops within Stirling, again, for those pupils who don't see themselves as cyclists, the feedback was that those shops were seen as scary and intimidating. So again, just to think about where your vouchers and where your incentives are coming from. So the next stages for us are very much trying to train and work with rural schools. So pupils that will be using public transport to go into Stirling Centre for further education, college, or even just sporting facilities. Once they arrive in the town centre, they can then use the bikes to move around the centre freely. We have to have greater presence in the schools, which has been very difficult this year for obvious reasons. But the feedback was very much that the earlier elements of the school, so S1 to S3, were very, very keen to use the bikes. So having a greater presence will form greater relationships and familiarity. So by the time those pupils get to S4 and S5, they're far more comfortable to approach us and seek out BIKESHARE membership. And just to keep things going this year, we've been working very closely with the primary schools and delivering safer routes transitioning to support and encourage those primary school pupils who are cycling to continue cycling into secondary. My details are there if anybody wishes to contact me later about the school BIKESHARE scheme. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you, Shirley. Some really valuable lessons shared there on setting up a school BIKESHARE scheme. and considerations for future development. Just a reminder, if anyone's got any questions for any of our presenters, please pop them in the chat box. And I'd now like to invite Tim Hughes to give his presentation on the story of a community scheme and approaches that he's taken to making that successful. Thanks, Tim.
Okay, just waiting for the slides to come up. Ah, there we go. Right. Good afternoon and welcome to Dunblane, to an operation that might be slightly less key than those explained already. But we are trying to promote e-bikes for local everyday short journeys, whatever you might think a short journey is, which is an interesting debate in itself. Next slide. Oh, next up there, right. So why do we start? Well, Dunblane is a small, constrained and hilly town with a population demographically skewed to people commuting to work and a large number of retirees. Despite the majority living within a mile of the community facilities and services, there is a very high use of cars for very short journeys within the town. In 2018, we were lucky enough to get some funding for an energy efficiency project at our local community centre. And this included a requirement to encourage active travel to and from the centre. So we were able to use some of that funding to obtain an e-bike for trials by centre users and community trust members. In 2019, we got additional funding for another bike and opened the scheme to all adult residents in Dunblane. Are now 3, going up to 5 volunteers very soon, are all cycle trainers or ride leaders, and manage the online booking for trial sessions with clients who all receive an information pack in advance of their trial opportunity. There is a £15 administration fee charged for each week of loan, which actually does cover basic running costs. The community centre car park is an excellent place to have our trials. We also provide accompanied rides with people before they then fly off with it for a week or 2 weeks to get and see how they get on by themselves. So what's happened? Over 21 months, we've had, it might seem small numbers, 72 loans by 66 people. With a great spike during the lockdown. 4 people were deemed insufficiently skilled at cycling to borrow a bike, and I think this might be an issue in other areas in terms of cycling competence before you let people loose. All ages are represented, but users have so far belonged, not unsurprisingly, to the mature end of the scale. Weekly distances varied widely. One individual only got as far as home before deciding to do more, but more positively, we know 19 users who were stimulated to buy their own e-bike and claimed to be using them for everyday travel, like going to work or shopping. Individual and survey-based feedback indicates some perhaps familiar observations. One, most users see bikes primarily as a good weather leisure item. There's widespread lack of road cycling confidence. We don't have an enormous amount of dedicated areas for cycling on the roads around Dunblane. And there are concerns about the cost and the weight of e-bikes if you're going to obtain your own model. In terms of modal shift, which is on everybody's minds in terms of having some kind of impact, it's rather difficult to get a good grip of that. We see ourselves as sowing a seed, and it may be some months or even years before you might see the blooms from that. Our future challenges for this small scheme is we need more e-bike options available than just our 2 bikes, for varying sizes, purposes, including commuting, ages and budgets, and to allow for longer loan periods. Ensuring that income covers running costs is very important for us, and we need to keep thinking about that with the terms of servicing bikes and insurance. We're increasingly keen on the idea of integrating road confidence building within the trial and loan periods, and are working out ways to do that in the future, as well as work on quantifying our impact. Now, this the last slide, I think most of these issues have been dealt with by the speakers, but I'd just like to emphasize one thing, as I think there are problems with people's skills and cycling confidence amongst other users, whether they're sharing the road spaces with bikes, pedestrians, or motorized vehicles. And I think a lot more resource needs to be put into developing people's skills, almost as much as is put into bikeability and other schemes at schools for children. I think enough has been said about the COVID implications, but there are lots of threats and opportunities associated with that. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Tim. Kind of demonstrating how a community-based scheme can really tailor to the needs of its users, but also some strong calls to action there, particularly for capacity building for some of the users and riders of your scheme. So now, wrapping up the presentations, I'd like to invite Lorna to start hers and sharing Como's view on BIKESHARE and a greener recovery. Thanks, Lorna.
Thanks, Harriet. And thanks to all the speakers. It's been brilliant to hear about what's going on around the country and hear about those kind of innovative solutions that are cropping up. It's fantastic. I'm going to quickly, because I want to get on to Q&A so we can hear what your thoughts are. I'm just going to quickly go through some slides here. We're going to talk about our programme, A Free Ride to a Green Recovery, and the programmes in Glasgow and Edinburgh, working with Anna Richardson on that. The impact of BIKESHARE more broadly and the contribution to public policy issues, and then just some final thoughts and recommendations about how we can grow BIKESHARE in Scotland. So, Como UK this summer worked in partnership with Glasgow City Council, Edinburgh City Council, Transport for Edinburgh, the 2 operators, Nextbike and Serco, and also Pass for All. We established a collaborative project to increase access to bikes and cycling in the 2 cities and encourage more people to cycle for everyday journeys and help ease pressure on public transport. And we called it A Free Ride to a Green Recovery. The trips were, what was offered was free 30-minute trips on BIKESHARE, on the BIKESHARE systems in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And these trips were funded by Smarter Choices, Smarter Places funding through Transport Scotland. In Glasgow, the first 30 minutes of cycle hire was made free to the user. And as Anna mentioned earlier, that offer has now been extended to March 2021 off the back of the success of that scheme to get more people cycling. In Edinburgh, the first 30 minutes were made free for the first couple of weeks to test that out. And then they introduced a back to work pass. So it was a heavily discounted pass. It cost £10 for the user for unlimited use for a 4-month period. So that was what the offers in both cities. Just looking at the impact, so Como UK is evaluating the impact of these promotions in Glasgow and Edinburgh. We're collecting data from the bike share operators to understand take up of the schemes, and we've conducted a user survey to understand users' experiences and understand a bit more about trip behaviour and purpose. So what we've found, it's early days, but what we've found is there has been a huge increase in the number of trips, the number of users, and also of new users as well. So in Edinburgh in August, trips were up by over 70% compared to August 2019. And in Glasgow, trips are up over 30% in August 2020 compared to 2019. So huge jumps in usage, and Oliver's talked about some of the trends there in both the cities. Another thing we've been able to evaluate is the number of new users for the schemes. So in Edinburgh, since the offers have been introduced, there's been a 70% increase in new users, and in Glasgow that figure is over 35%. So the scheme is doing what we wanted it to do, which was to attract new people to BIKESHARE and try and encourage more people to use BIKESHARE for those everyday journeys. As I said, we have also conducted a user survey. So people that are using the BIKESHARE scheme, we've asked them some questions to understand trip behaviour and purpose. And some really nice takeaways here is that 58% of respondents said that BIKESHARE was the trigger to get them cycling again, and that was 30% cycling for the first time after a long break, so that's over 5 years, and 27% after a shorter break of between 1 and 4 years. We've also 74% of respondents said that they cycle much more often since using BIKESHARE as well. And finally, 11% of users have gone on to buy their own bike as a result of using the BIKESHARE scheme through these offers. So that's really been brilliant to hear. And the main reasons for choosing BIKESHARE, probably not surprising, but the top reasons have been health and well-being, both physical and the mental health benefits, convenience to save time to get to places that are not served by public transport, and also as an alternative to public transport during the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are just some of the key takeaways. We will be publishing a full report on the impact of the free BIKESHARE and Back to Work Pass offers, and we'll be publishing that later in the year. So just wanted to also mention here, on BIKESHARE itself, we know that it already supports a number of key public policy issues. So I've got some up on the screen there. There's so many, but investment in cycling capacity and infrastructure following COVID-19 has been really important for making cycling safer, increasing cycling levels. But we do here at Como, we want to make sure that everyone can benefit. BIKESHARE removes some of the barriers to cycling, including the cost of buying and maintaining a bike and having somewhere to store one. It's a carbon-free way to get around, as many people have mentioned today. It's used for short trips, for getting from A to B, and for commuting as well. And it's also used in conjunction with public transport as a solution to the first and last mile problem. And it provides an accessible means of activity for many people as well. So as it is accessible, it's affordable, it's flexible, we think it can play an increasingly important role in Scotland's green recovery, and by providing an alternative means to car travel. There is a huge potential, as I said. There's over half of all journeys in Scotland are 5 kilometres or less, and that's the distance that can be covered by a bike. So there is a huge potential to do more, to have more cycling and be delivered through BIKESHARE. Como UK has conducted research into the potential scale and benefits of shared mobility in Scotland. We looked at the number of BIKESHARE trips we looked at the number of short car trips of 5 kilometres or less that could be converted to BIKESHARE. So we use census data to calculate that there are almost 500,000 short car trips that could be converted to BIKESHARE, and that would result in 64,000 tonnes of carbon being saved every year and 199 million fewer car trips each year. So there is a huge potential here to do more with BIKESHARE. Just wanted to finish up on supporting the growth of BIKESHARE very, very quickly. We think that BIKESHARE should be recognised as a form of public transport, and therefore should be viewed. It should be looked at through the view of government to provide subsidy so that you can provide BIKESHARE in places that are not commercially viable, that tackles a range of issues, including transport poverty, helping people in low-income communities, for example. We also think there's a case for direct investment, both capital and revenue, and that there should be multi-year revenue funding for it. And also, not one for the Scottish Government, but for the UK Government, we think there should be a review of VAT and tax treatment for BIKESHARE, because public transport is not subject to VAT, and we think that there's a very strong argument for BIKESHARE to be treated in the same way. So I'm going to finish it there because I'm aware of time, and we want to go on to the Q&A. Okay.
Thanks, Lorna. Some good information there on carbon savings through BIKESHARE, and also what you think needs to happen to improve the development of it in Scotland. I'd now like to invite all the presenters to come back to the screen, turning on sound and audio. It's 4 minutes to 3, so I suggest we have a couple of questions which have come through from listeners, and then we'll wrap up with final slide. So this is a question from Beth Morley for Anna. How much do you seek to integrate the BIKESHARE scheme into other forms of transport within Glasgow?
I think it's something that we need to do a lot more. We've just launched a consultation on our transport strategy for Glasgow, and within that, one of the questions we're asking is whether we should be looking at integrating both payment methods and also just looking at more mobility hubs. So how do we fix, I think somebody mentioned the first and last mile problem. Certainly it's something that BIKESHARE could do really well. If you're using a hire bike to get you to a bus or a train station, you're not worried about your own bike being parked up all day. So it could be an optimal way to use BIKESHARE, and especially where we have parts of the city that perhaps it's just a wee bit too far to cycle into the city centre or where you're going, but you can use that BIKESHARE just for maybe, you know, the start or the end of your journey. I think that'd be really useful. So it's something we want to do much more of, and I want us to look far more at, rather than what mode is somebody using for a journey, it's how is that journey going to be done most efficiently, and sometimes that's going to be over 2 different modes.
Great, thanks, Anna. Another question from Alvaro Villagran. This is to Shirley. Alvaro says, a great initiative introducing teenagers to BIKESHARE. And he wondered more specifically, did you have to make any changes to the terms and conditions to the next bike service or the BIKESHARE insurance policy to allow kids aged 14 to 18 to use the bikes?
It's probably a question for Nextbike, actually. We negotiated with Nextbike reducing it to 14, and they agreed that. So any implications of that would come under Nextbike's own insurance. But that's the only change that we made, and the increase in duration journey time from 30 minutes to 60 minutes. But again, Nextbike are still responsible for the BIKESHARE scheme, so it would be their insurance that would be covering that.
Okay, thanks. That's probably useful to follow up on for the schemes that are thinking of setting up a project with you know, for that audience. But thanks, Shirley. We also have a question from Antonia for Oliver. And Antonia's asking, Oliver, do you think public BIKESHARE will need to move more into suburbs to react to the COVID?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, at the moment, bike docking stations tend to be located in city centres and obvious sort of tourist places. But yes, if it's going to be a serious, you know, sustainable form of commute or just moving into the city centre from suburbs, then it is important to have docking stations out there. But don't need to be many. I believe that people, if they want to use this mode of transport, they will, you know, walk half a mile or so at least to get to their nearest one, as long as there are bikes available there. But yes, we do need to have them in the suburbs. Obviously, if we are in the suburbs, then there's only a certain number of people that will use them because population densities will be lower, and then there are economic potential issues for the operators of doing that. But definitely making bike share useful for utility usages, for general usages, rather than just focusing on commuters and tourists. Absolutely, we definitely need docking stations in the suburbs.
Thanks, Oliver. Clear reply, that was good. Here's one for everyone. This will be the final one. And any other questions that have been asked, because there have been a few, we will get back to you after the webinar. What do the other presenters think of Oliver's prediction that e-scooters could eat bike shares lunch? Really good, really meaty one to end the webinar on. Don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Well, I'll come in on it, but it seems that, I mean, we just don't know what's going to happen. And I think actually, as Oliver said, the trials are all happening down in England, and it'd be great to get some trials happening in Scotland. There is a legislative issue, but hopefully the Scottish Government can work through that and work with local councils to try and get e-scooters as well, because I think they could be an important part of the mix, as Oliver says. I know you say they're not active travel. I think there is a bit of active travel with an e-scooter as well, and certainly good for providing an alternative to car journeys. So I'd be interested to hear more about what happens in the trials.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite an interesting. I'd like to have a go on one so I can understand what it's all about. But in comparison to an e-bike, there doesn't seem to be any real controlling mechanism. I know there's a limit to the speed you can do, but you just wonder how you're going to control the skills of the people using them.
Anyone have an answer for that? Oh, Shirley.
No, but just different modes of transport will suit different people, ages, abilities. If it's cool, not cool. If you're not as balanced, then maybe a scooter wouldn't suit you, but a bike would. So I think it would be no problem having a multitude. I've seen bike stations in Europe where you have, you can choose, it's like a pick and mix between a scooter and a bike. It's not one station for one mode of transport. And I think if we can facilitate that variety to suit all sorts of needs, then it's still active travel in the greatest sense.
I think that's a really good point to finish on, Shirley, and a good way to look at mobility and shared transport in general, that there are different modes that suit different people and different areas. And that's kind of COMO's, that's what we want to do. We want to look at the different developments that can go hand in hand with that. So I think I'll wrap up Q&A. Apologies, there wasn't as much time, but we had a lot of really interesting content coming from the presenters. Thanks for that, Dave. The slide. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for quite a diverse range of content within the webinar. The key messages that I've certainly taken are that bike share is diverse in Scotland. Through Oliver's presentation, a really useful insight into data and how they're being used, and also some call to actions to see bike share developed in the way that it needs to. In fact, all presenters had calls to action, which is really great, particularly ongoing funding, multi-year funding, and which would probably be really useful for Tim's project from a community development point of view. So thanks for that, everyone. Just a couple of things. Como have produced, my colleague Antonia has produced a really great guidance document on setting up a successful bike share scheme. This is more for the biggest schemes, so you can find that on our website. And pretty soon we'll have some guidance to accompany that on setting up a community bike share scheme. Again, that can be accessed on the website. Como's conference is 17th to the 20th of November, where bike share will be featuring alongside other modes of shared transport. And for listeners who might be interested in our micro grants, this is a small pot of money for bike share schemes, community bike share schemes who are looking to share their bikes in a particular area. And again, information on the website for that. And our UK annual bike share survey that both Lorna and I mentioned, providing some really useful data about the users of bike share and people's opinions of their experience when they're using it, will be available soon too. And a lot of the content that has come out, we will be picking up running further webinars on specific themes, and also a survey will be sent out following this presentation, following the webinar, just to get any feedback on what you might like to see on BIKESHARE webinars in the future. So I think that's probably it. Thank you to our participants. We've had a really good amount of people online, so looking forward to catching up with you. Hopefully you'll follow on with the projects who have spoken, the presenters who've spoken, and many thanks to our presenters.
Thank you.
Thanks.
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 Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.